Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. Our last episode focused on my trip to New York City, where I was privileged to be able to sit in the reading rooms of both the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Morgan Library and Museum and view and handle some ancient biblical manuscripts. And so far, in our current series on manuscript hunters, we've studied the lives and accomplishments of those brave men and women who traveled by land and sea to ancient libraries, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and genizas, and who spent days and nights in the hot desert sun in Egypt, uncovering those manuscripts from beneath the sand or from those churches, genizas, and libraries. Their travels were not comfortable, and long and dangerous sea voyages, traveling over difficult terrain on horse or camelback was common. Disease and danger was close by. And we continue along this path of manuscript hunters, but diverge a little bit in that this episode and the next one or two will talk about those who acquired or purchased ancient biblical manuscripts without getting their hands dirty, so to speak. We're turning our attention from manuscript hunters to manuscript collectors. And in today's episode, we'll bring you one such famous bibliophile. That is Chester Beatty, Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, to you and me. And by way of summary, Sir Alfred Chester Beatty was an American mining magnate, philanthropist, collector, and one of the most successful businessmen of his generation, who earned the nickname King of Copper as a reference to how he acquired his fortune. He became a naturalized British citizen in 1933, was knighted in 1954, and made an honorary citizen of Ireland in 1957. He was a collector of African, Asian, European, and Middle Eastern manuscripts, rare printed books, Dürer prints, and other objects of art. Upon his move to Dublin in 1950, he established the Chester Beatty Library to house his personal collection, and it opened to the public in 1954. The collections were bequeathed to the Irish people and entrusted to the care of the state by virtue of his Irish will. He donated many papyri to the British Museum. His second wife's collection of Marie Antoinette's personal furniture was given to the Louvre. Many of his personal paintings that once hung in the picture gallery of his London home, he provided to the National Gallery of Ireland. He also founded the Chester Beatty Institute in London, which was later renamed the Institute of Cancer Research and is now part of the Royal Marsden Hospital in London. He lived a long and prosperous life and died at the age of 92 in 1968. I was 14 years old at the time. Now, why do I spend time on the personal lives of these men and women who brought us such biblical treasures? Why not just concentrate on their actual finds themselves and their significance for New Testament or biblical studies? Well, I want you to understand the men and the women behind the manuscript, a little bit of their personal story, and what drove them to seek these manuscripts and at what cost they have come to us. So we'll look at Sir Alfred in three ways. First, his early life and career. Second, his collections. And third, we want to take a look at three important New Testament manuscripts in his collection and their significance to New Testament studies and Bible translations. So Beatty was born on February 7th, 1875, in New York City to a middle-class family and reared in a home on what is now the site of Rockefeller Center. Wouldn't you have loved to sell that property? He was born to Irish parents Hetty and John Beatty. His father was a banker and stockbroker, and Chester was the youngest of three sons. As a young boy, he harbored early interest in collecting minerals and stamps. Young Chet, as he came to be known, attended a private school in Dobbs Ferry, New York, studied briefly at Princeton, and later graduated first in his class from the Columbia University School of Mines in 1898. He then headed out west to Denver, Colorado, which was then one of the most important mining centers in the United States. His academic qualifications didn't seem to matter to his new crew, and he took a $2 a day job as a mucker, meaning he cleared away rock and soil from the mine tunnels. But within a few months, his expertise was appreciated, as his knowledge of minerals led to some gold finds, and he was offered a job as a mine superintendent. He climbed the ladder quickly. He started his own consulting company and in 1903 became assistant general manager of the Guggenheim Exploration Company. In 1900, his earnings were $1,200 a year. And he remarked to one of his friends that, "I still have beer tastes, but I hope to get to champagne one day." And that day came soon. In 1905, he returned from Denver to New York City as a millionaire. And he built a new home on Fifth Avenue and 73rd Street, East 73rd Street, which is only 7 blocks away from today's Metropolitan Museum of Art. At the time, it was known as Millionaire's Row. He had married Grace Ricard in Denver in 1900, and they had 2 children, a girl, Ninette, and a son, Chester Jr. In 1911, unfortunately, Grace died of typhoid fever, leaving Chester with 2 young children. He visited London and became friends with a fellow mining engineer, Herbert Hoover, who had offices there. And yes, that Herbert Hoover, future president of the United States. In 1912, Beatty purchased Baroda House in Kensington Palace Gardens and moved with his 2 young children to London the following year. London was the perfect place for a base for European and widening mining interests. I'm showing you a picture here of the Baroda House as he knew it, and then one after renovations as it appears now. It was his main residence for the next 40 years. Shortly after the move to London, he married his second wife and fellow New Yorker, Edith Dunn, on June 21st, 1913. He and Edith were both avid art collectors, and Edith had very expensive taste. During the World War I years, he spent $54,751 on jewelry for her. She was a quite avid art collector in her own right, and particularly favored Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings. They traveled extensively over the next 3 decades, and they were together until he became estranged from her after his move to Dublin in 1950. In 1914, Beatty founded the London-based mining company Selection Trust, and during the 1920s, the business expanded to acquire interests in countries including the USSR, the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, and the colony and protectorate of Sierra Leone. Beatty continued his fortune in northern Rhodesia, present-day Zambia, and the Belgian Congo, present-day Democratic Republic of Congo. And there he exploited the copper belt, and this is where he had the nickname the King of Copper. Now let's look at his interest in collecting art. It was after his move to London that his interest in collecting fine art and manuscripts went into high gear. In 1913, he and Edith made the first of many visits to Egypt, where he befriended wealthy fellow travelers, some of whom were great collectors like himself. He visited so often, he actually built his own home there so they could stay during their winter visits. Each year, his family would leave London, usually in December, for Paris, where they visited antique shops and dealers. And for Marseille, they set sail to Egypt. The return trip would vary to include Constantinople or Naples, Rome, and Venice. This provided Beatty with solid contacts with continental and Egyptian art dealers. Beatty acquired manuscripts, printed books, and Dürer prints. In 1917, he started to increase his spending on illuminated manuscripts, but his greatest additions were made when he and his family embarked upon a 6-month tour of Japan and China. His purchases there included Chinese dragon robes, imperial jade books, and Japanese printed scrolls. And by the early 1920s, Beatty was no longer an amateur collector. His library had grown so large he had to convert his conservatory and the stables at his stately Baroda house into another library. He also kept part of his collection at his country home in Kent. He soon had to hire a full-time librarian as well as secretaries, and he commissioned scholars to undertake missions to Italy, Germany, and Greece to source out manuscripts for his collections. He was in active competition with the British Museum and the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, Beatty's single most important group of advisors included almost all of the senior curators in the British Museum's Department of Antiquities, along with some Cambridge academics. The greatest papyri manuscripts were purchased through dealers, but Beatty also had the advantage of being a sponsor of excavations, and he had the exclusive rights to those finds before they hit the open market. In 1929, Beatty made his usual trip to Cairo to spend the winter. He toured his normal antique shops and met with dealers with whom he had done business in the past. One such dealer had acquired a cache of papyrus codices and offered them for sale. Now, this was significant in itself, that is, papyrus codices as opposed to parchment codices. That dealer we now know as Maurice Naaman called the Lion of Cairo the most prominent antiquities dealer in the city. But the experienced and now savvy Beatty believed that Naaman was withholding a much larger part of the find back from him, perhaps for a later sale to another buyer. With restrained enthusiasm, Beatty sent a telegram to his curator friend, Eric Miller, at the British Museum with the details of this cache of papyri. In reply to Beatty, and in code, Miller responded with this telegram: "Silver mine very rich, has 3 shafts, stop. Gold mine rich, has 4 shafts, stop. Should buy both without fail, especially silver mine, stop." Now, Miller had sent a copy of the telegram to Beatty's business secretary, John Wooderson, explaining the coded reply. Mines meant manuscripts. Rich meant old, and shafts referred to their date. 3 shafts was 3rd century, 4 shafts was 4th century. And back at the British Museum, Miller had caused a sensation among his academic colleagues as he discussed the find to senior curators Frederick Kenyon and Harold Bell, both of whom agreed the find was of great importance. Beatty's purchase would be followed by many more, as he gradually acquired up to 90% of the manuscript cache that were to be judged the earliest copies of many New Testament texts, as well as some of the earliest copies of the Septuagint. Beatty's fame as a book collector now exploded, and he received letters offering to sell him rare books and manuscripts, including one said to have been written by Jesus. Wouldn't that be a find? His papyrus collection was developed into one of the most important in the world, one that no other single collector and few public institutions could match. Take that, J. Pierpont Morgan. Now, it is true the University of Michigan also purchased some of these manuscripts from the same find, and Beatty worked hard to negotiate reuniting their portions with his. But let's take a closer look at how this particular cache of Christian text was announced to the world. To do so, we must talk a minute about the man who first brought these manuscripts to the general public's attention, and that would be Sir Frederick George Kenyon. At the time, Kenyon was England's premier scholar of textual criticism and papyrology. He was the director of the British Museum from 1909 to 1930 and the governing member of the British Exploration Fund. He was also a member of the British Academy, and other academies as well. So by virtue of his associations and contacts, he was the star witness to major literary discoveries during 5 decades. And he, along with Harold Bell, was asked to examine Beatty's papyri and make a preliminary analysis. In short order, Kenyon made their findings public. And on November 19th, 1931, on page 13 of the Times of London, his article appeared for the first time, telling the world of this find. The title read, "The Text of the Bible, A New Discovery, More Papyri from Egypt" by Sir Frederick Kenyon. He opened his article by surveying recent biblical discoveries from the past 90 years, such as the Curetonian Syriac Gospels, Tischendorf's Sinaiticus in 1844, the Sisters of Sinai and their Syriac palimpsest discovery at St. Catherine's in 1892, and most recently the Oxyrhynchus Papyri of Grenfell and Hunt. Kenyon continued, "I have now, after an interval of 25 years, the privilege of making known a discovery of biblical manuscripts which rivals any of these in interest and surpasses them all in antiquity." He went on to describe in general terms the Old and New Testament manuscripts that made up this collection, which comprised 12 folios of papyri codices. In 1933, Kenyon published several volumes entitled The Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri, in which he went into scholarly detail describing the manuscripts, their provenance, the composition, dating, and so forth. And since then, many books and scholarly articles have been written describing these texts and their significance for New Testament studies. One of the best contemporary summaries of these manuscripts comes from Brent Nongbury's book, God's Library, The Archaeology of the Earliest Christian Manuscripts. And we'll be referring to it and making use of it for some of what follows in this episode. Please keep in mind that Beatty's collection includes many Hebrew Bible manuscripts as well, but we choose to focus only on the New Testament portions in this episode. Of the New Testament part, we break it down into 3 sections. First, the Gospel and Acts, which were originally bound as a single codex, referred to as Papyrus 45, or its abbreviation P45. Second, some letters of Paul in Hebrews, known as P46. And thirdly, the book of Revelation, known as P47. The images of these manuscripts that we will show are from the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, whose 6-person team digitized them at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin in the summer of 2013. Some of these leaves reside at the University of Michigan. And what you are now seeing is a selection of images from the Gospels and Acts. And these are from Codex P45. Here is a leaf from Matthew chapter 20. And here is a leaf from Mark chapter 8. A leaf from Luke 13. Here's another leaf from John 10. And a leaf from John chapter 11. Here's a leaf from Acts chapter 5. Another leaf from Acts chapter 13. And finally, of the selection of papyri from P45 is one from Acts 17. Next, we view some images from some of the letters of Paul and the book of Hebrews. These are from Codex P46. First, a look at a leaf from 1 Corinthians 2. Next, from 2 Corinthians 12. And now we focus on a close-up of the text from 2 Corinthians 12. Then a leaf from Ephesians chapter 1. Next, a leaf from Hebrews 2. And lastly, from P46, a leaf from Hebrews 3. And now we view 3 sample images from the book of Revelation. These are from Codex P47 from the Beatty collection. First, a leaf from Revelation chapter 9. and next from Revelation chapter 11, and finally a leaf from chapter 14 of the book of Revelation. Now, what is the significance of the Chester Beatty collection of New Testament manuscripts? Well, we can summarize conclusions for the Gospel in Acts in the following 5 ways. Number 1, the Gospel and Acts Codex, P45, challenged the then reigning theory of the development of the text of the New Testament. At that time, the oldest codex witnesses to the New Testament were Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, both dated to the 4th century. But Beatty's find set the clock back 100 or so years. And various dates, all based on paleography, range from 200 AD to the end of that century. Secondly, P45, which contained the Gospel and Acts, originally contained the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as Acts of the Apostles. It is the earliest surviving codex to combine these texts into one volume, reflecting the early Christian practice of grouping key writings together in a single book. And this suggests a growing sense of a canon of authoritative Christian texts by the early 3rd century. Thirdly, P45 is a codex, meaning a bound book format, rather than a continuous scroll, demonstrating the early preference for codices in the early Christian communities. This format was more portable, practical, and symbolic of a distinct Christian identity. Number 4, regarding its provenance. Unfortunately, it is not exactly clear where these manuscripts were originally found. Kenyon initially speculated they were from an early Christian church, library, or monastery in the Fayum district of Egypt. A Coptologist, Carl Schmidt, said they were from a Christian church or monastery in the ancient Egyptian city of Aphroditopolis. Another scholar, Henry Sanders, who edited the Pauline fragments, said they were found in a Coptic graveyard somewhere in the region of the Upper Nile. And other theories have been put forward, but the truth is we just do not know. One thing we do know is that they came from somewhere in Egypt. Fifthly, the Chester Beatty Papyrus P45, with its Gospel and Acts, dates to the 3rd century, representing an early textual tradition of the New Testament. Its readings are often shorter and less harmonized compared to the later Byzantine manuscripts, or the Textus Receptus, used in the King James Version. The New International Version, based on modern critical texts such as the Nestle Aland UBS editions, incorporates readings from P45 and other early manuscripts that differ from the readings you will find in the King James Bible. We are providing 3 typical passages where the NIV, the ESV, and other modern translations use the P45 text rather than the text based upon the King James Version, the Textus Receptus. For example, Matthew 18, verse 11 in the King James Version reads, "For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost." In the New International Version, the English Standard Version, and other modern translations, this verse is omitted as is absent from many early manuscripts, including P45. The verse is considered a later addition harmonizing with Luke 19:10. P45 thus reflects the shorter, considered original text. Mark 6:11 in the King James Version includes the longer phrase, "Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." In the NIV and ESV, other modern translations, this sentence is missing. And so P45 supports the shorter reading, suggesting the longer phrase was a later expansion. And one more example will suffice. Acts 8:37 in the King James Version reads, "And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." Again, the NIV, ESV, and other modern translations omit the verse entirely as it is absent in early manuscripts such as P45. The verse is considered a later addition to emphasize doctrinal clarity. So, along with the Gospels and Acts, the Pauline letters in Hebrews and the Revelation, those manuscripts of the Beatty collection, also are among our oldest witnesses of those texts, and they show the wide geographic spread of the Christian movement into Egypt in the early 3rd century. And they give us an early witness for the codex form of binding that would later become the norm. These and many more examples shows us that the reason the newer English Bible translations differ from the King James Version in so many places is that they consider a wider body of text from which to construct their Bible. Modern critical texts do not rely only on the relatively few and late manuscript from the Textus Receptus, but incorporate finds from the Papyri of Oxyrhynchus, the manuscripts in the Beatty, the Bodmer collections, and other collections, as well as early versions such as the Syriac, Latin, and more. Now, some would say that the modern translations omit or add verses. But if it wasn't original to begin with, it's not considered omitted or added. It is judged to be the earliest form of the text, and it is what it is. It might be the King James translation that added a phrase or omitted one. Chester Beatty died on January 19, 1968, at the Princess Grace Clinic in Monte Carlo. He's buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. He was the first private citizen in Ireland ever to be honored with a state funeral.
And so the last tribute to the man who has bestowed so much on Ireland. Now he himself belongs to the nation.
His library now has a home in Dublin Castle where you can visit today. Well, we should call it a day at this point and leave you to consult the many references for further study that I provided in the description box. In every episode, I provide links to books, to lectures, talks, YouTube videos, professional and lay articles, and links to sources I've used in the episode. And I hope you make use of them for further research. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode featuring Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, the man and his collection. And next episode, we will continue along this topic of manuscript collectors. If you enjoy what we bring to you from this channel, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. We've just surpassed our first 1,000 subs, and we hope to keep it going. My goal with the channel is to demystify much of what passes in biblical studies. The academic world can often confuse you with various opinions, the conservative, the liberal, the avant-garde points of view. If you stick with us, we'll make sense of it. And we'll leave you with the outro of photographs taken from Beatty's life and work. So, be well, and soon we'll bring you another informative episode from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.
Tribute to the man who has bestowed so much on Ireland. Now he himself belongs to the nation.